Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the SEC's focus on ESG and what that means for investment advisors. As Megan said, I'm Sarah Busher from the IAA, and I am delighted to introduce our great panel of speakers today. We have Kelly Gibson, who is director of the SEC's Philadelphia Regional Office and leader of the Enforcement Division's Task Force on ESG and Climate Issues. We also have Amy Greer and Jen Klass, who are both partners and co-chairs of Baker McKenzie's North American Financial Regulation and Enforcement Practice. Thank you all for joining us today. For those of you seeking continuing education credit, there is a link to a continuing education form that you received in today's reminder email, and I will provide 2 code words during the webinar for that credit. And the deadline to submit that form is December 17th. So let's move on to our agenda. We're going to discuss the many developments at the SEC on ESG and recent areas of SEC focus in this area. And then we're going to talk about considerations for investment advisors in managing risks related to SEC examinations and enforcement in this area. As Megan said, you are welcome to submit questions through the chat as we go along, and we encourage that. And at the bottom of this slide, you will see the standard SEC disclaimer for Kelly. So Kelly, one significant development at the SEC is the development of the Division of Enforcement Task Force that you lead on climate and ESG. Tell us about that.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I will just note from my public statements that the views I express today are my own and not necessarily those of the commission, the commissioners, or the staff. So as you just mentioned, we formed the task force in March of 2021. We have around 24 attorneys and accountants from the regional offices, our headquarters, and our specialized units. And we have a number of missions in the task force. So we evaluate and pursue tips, referrals, and whistleblower complaints on ESG related issues. Our task force members also provide expertise to teams working on ESG matters across the division. And we help coordinate enforcement ESG efforts with other SEC offices and divisions that have ESG related responsibilities, such as the divisions of corporation finance, investment management, and examinations. So our initial focus is on 2 important areas. The first is on issuers, climate, and ESG disclosures, and the other is on investment advisors, ESG funds, and strategies. And to be clear, when we're evaluating these areas and determining whether enforcement investigations or actions are appropriate, we're thinking about long-standing and well-established principles of disclosure and fiduciary duty. And so let me just touch on for a minute what we're not evaluating. So we're not weighing in on the merits of a particular line of business or investment strategy to assess whether or not it's environmentally friendly. That's important work, but that's not within the SEC's purview. And what we are focused on is whether companies and investment professionals are doing what they say and saying what they do. So generally speaking, in the issuer space, we're thinking about, like I said, the longstanding principles of materiality and disclosure. So we focus on issuers' disclosures of climate risk under existing rules and guidance, focusing on what issuers say or fail to say in public filings or other public statements. So firms should make sure that when they do speak on these issues, that the disclosures are not materially false or misleading, or that they're not omitting material information. And then in the asset management space, we're also focusing on longstanding principles of materiality and disclosure, as well as advisors' fiduciary duties. So advisors generally get to decide how they market their funds and strategies. So we'll look to make sure they're doing what they say they're going to do.
Thank you. And I think, Kelly, it was an important point that you made about the SEC is not in the business of evaluating the merits of one ESG strategy over another, right? That's one question that we've gotten. Are there certain strategies that are preferred or not? And that's not really the focus. The focus is a lot, like you said, on are you doing what you say and saying what you do?
Absolutely.
Okay. Megan, could we move to the next slide? Okay, and I think you focused on a lot of these points. And it sounds like the Division of Investment Management is also one that you're working with in this area. And we're going to talk soon about developments there, but it sounds like this is not just that there's a lot of coordination among the different offices. Is that fair, even when policies are being developed?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think it's important that as a commission, we're one division within the commission, but we need to make sure that we're being consistent across the board. And so we just make sure that anyone who touches on these issues, we're aware of what they're doing and they're aware of what we're doing.
Okay, thanks. Megan, could we move on to the next slide? Okay, so outside of the task force that Kelly was talking about, there have been some other developments at the SEC. Amy, talk about the request for comment.
Well, that was pretty early on. I mean, sort of almost immediately following the change in administration, then acting chair Lee, looking back to the 2010 climate guidance, sought comment on how that might be updated to today, and that was broadened to incorporate other ESG issues, and has since also been broadened in comment by the current chair in terms of what it is that we can expect from the commission when new regulations actually are promulgated, or at least offered for comment, to include things like human capital issues. But initially, the request for comment, and that comment period closed in some months ago, the commission sought comment from various stakeholders on what the new regulations might look like, how the world had essentially changed since 2010 in terms of what disclosures should be looking like. And obviously, things are different from 2010 to now. That said, I know IAA had some views on this, Sarah.
Yes, we did submit a comment or comments in response to this request, and we advocated for consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosures of material information by corporate issuers on climate and other ESG matters. And we also supported the SEC developing a framework for these disclosures, and we suggested that they leverage existing frameworks that are out there, and there are a number of frameworks. We also made the point that both quantitative and qualitative disclosures are informative in this area. Trying to drill everything down to a number or figure, that doesn't necessarily work for all facets of this. So we made those points.
Well, you hit the magic words, because consistent and comparable are the two magic words that Chair Gensler uses all the time in discussing what we can expect from the SEC, or what he believes that investors and the market want in a regulatory regime. I mean, the discussion of what's material, of course, has raised some additional discussion between and among the commissioners, and it will be interesting to see how that shakes out. Of some interest, I think, the sample letter that the Division of Corporation Finance issued sort of brings that into sort of higher relief. The Division of Corporation Finance issued what it called a sample letter to issuers for consideration. And my point there is, this is a letter that it would be expected that CorpFin might send out to issuers relating to their current periodic filings, and is based, they say, on the 2010 guidance on disclosure related to climate change. And of interest to me is this materiality issue, because of the fact that CorpFin in its sample letter does presuppose the need to harmonize things like non-SEC disclosures or non-financial materiality type disclosures with the other kinds of marketing, social media, sustainability reporting, the other sorts of ESG types of discussion points that issuers put out into the marketplace currently, the voluntary reporting, the unstructured, aspirational discussion points about ESG issues. And essentially, CorpFin asks the question, if this is important enough to put out there, how is it not material? And I think that that is the nub of it for a lot of public companies. And I think it will also be an issue for investment advisors in discussing what is marketing material and what is a disclosure. And the distinction between the two, I think, has become harder to make in this particular area and around these particular issues. Obviously, this CorpFin letter discusses a number of other issues that I think will also be relevant, given that you see these things repeated in a number of different places across the agency. Things like material effects of climate change that may affect the business or operations, monitoring legislative developments, and what are material expenditures on climate risk. The kinds of things that we have seen the Commission focus on in a variety of different ways on these issues generally. And so the expectation is that if you haven't incorporated these things into your public filings, CorpFin wants to know why.
Yeah. No, and I think there's definitely, as we're going to talk about later, some similarities as we talk about investment advisors. At this point, I'm going to give out the first CLE code word, and it is 14. 14 is the first CLE code word. Okay, Megan, we can have the next slide. So Jen, we're also expecting to see some more activity from the SEC in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And the SEC just published, or Chair Gensler just published, the fall 2021 regulatory agenda, which lists, proposed rulemaking and different rulemaking at different stages. It doesn't mean that any of it will actually happen, but it's helpful to see what the SEC's priorities are. And many of the issues we've been talking about, particularly on the public company side, in terms of enhanced disclosure around human capital management, climate-related risks and opportunities, and board diversity, are all listed on the regulatory agenda as different rulemakings in different areas where the SEC is considering requiring mandatory disclosure. And I think that's important, and actually has been widely accepted by both the investor community as well as the public company community, because I think on both sides, what's happening right now is that there's a lot of inconsistent information. And so when investment advisors try to evaluate companies based on ESG criteria, they can't always find what they want, or there are some areas where there's very deep information and other areas where there's simply no coverage. And that creates some tensions that we can talk about. So I think that is all interesting on the public company side. On the investment advisor and investment company side, the SEC is also focused on potential disclosure, and the rulemaking initiative contemplates that the SEC would address the names rule, which they had previously proposed some changes to, which essentially identifies how registered investment companies are named and what requirements need to be in place with respect to their investment objectives in order to call something, for example, an ESG fund. So I think that will be important, but they are also more generally talking about just requirements for investment companies and investment advisors related to ESG factors, including ESG claims and related disclosures. And so it's not clear exactly what that type of rulemaking would look like, but certainly it does substantiate the fact that, as noted by Kelly and as noted by the ESG risk alert that we'll talk about, the SEC is very focused on how advisors talk about ESG and the statements and claims that they're making in their marketing and their advertising, as well as how they define and implement their investment strategies. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and then we also have on here IOSCO, which is the Organization of Securities Regulators, and they've been active in this area too.
Yeah, they have been, and it's interesting because both the SEC and the CFTC are members of IOSCO. And as I'm sure everyone knows, there's a tremendous amount of regulatory inconsistency from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so these efforts by IOSCO to try to put out broad frameworks and principles that, that regulators can look to when they're creating rulemaking, I think are helpful. Also helpful for advisors to see where the regulatory train may be headed. So IOSCO has put out a couple of different reports. Just at the end of November, they published a report on sustainability related practices, policies and procedures, and disclosure in asset management. And that builds on a prior report they had published around disclosure for public companies, for issuers. And then in November, they also published a report on ESG ratings and data products. And I think this is particularly important to investment advisors, again, because the concept of how to get good data, the data sort of creates the framework for everything you do in terms of managing ESG related strategies. And so getting that good data, whether it's from third parties or from rating agencies, and also understanding what the methodology is, what the assumptions are, et cetera, is pretty critical to investment advisors.
Yeah, I thought both of the reports were interesting, and especially on the asset management report, they focused on governance, investment strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And it'll be interesting to see on the SEC rulemaking, if that comes out, what the areas of focus are there too. So, all right, Megan, if we can move to the next slide. So probably the most helpful document for advisors to review from the SEC related to ESG investing is the risk alert that was issued earlier this year in April by the Division of Examinations. Kelly, let's start with some background on why that was issued.
Sure. So the Division of Examinations has had ESG in its priorities for the last 2 years, and it's been doing these exams for the past few years. And so they issued this risk alert in April of 2021 to highlight some of the areas that exams is focused on and what they've seen in those areas. And what they've seen, and it's similar to the perspective I shared about enforcement's involvement, but exams has noted that there's just this real increase in investor demand, and advisors have responded by offering and expanding their offerings in this type of investing. And we're seeing some risks result from this rapid growth in demand, the increased number of products and services, and as we mentioned, this lack of standardized and precise ESG definitions that can create confusion for investors, especially for products and services offered to these retail investors that we've been talking about. And I'll just mention similarly how I did with enforcement to what exams is and isn't looking for. Again, exams is not looking to make judgments on the merits of any particular strategy. And again, they're just looking to see what are the advisors saying, and then what are they doing? Are their policies and procedures aligned? Are their compliance programs aligned? And we're going to get into more detail on some of these areas, but just at a high level, the risk alert touched on the major areas of portfolio management, performance advertising and marketing, and these compliance programs.
Great. Yeah. So the portfolio management, that's the first item that is discussed in a lot of detail, I would say, in the risk alert. And if Megan, if we can move to the next slide. Kelly, what types of issues is the SEC seeing related to ESG portfolio management?
So with regard to portfolio management, exams is including a review of the firm's policies, procedures, and practices related to ESG and its use of ESG related terminology, due diligence and other processes for selecting, investing in, and monitoring investments in view of the firm's disclosed ESG investing approaches, including the use of third-party ratings. And so some of the things that they saw some potentially misleading statements regarding ESG investing processes and representations regarding the adherence to global ESG frameworks. So they saw, for example, portfolio management practices that differed from client disclosures in required disclosure documents, such as Form ADV Part 2A, and other client investor facing documents like advisory agreements, offering materials, responses to RFPs, and due diligence questionnaires. And then with regard to policies and procedures, they noted that some controls were inadequate to maintain, monitor, and update clients' ESG related investing guidelines, mandates, and restrictions. And this leads to a risk that prohibited securities get included in client portfolios. So for example, they saw inadequate controls around the implementation and monitoring of clients' negative screens. So for example, prohibitions on investments in certain industries such as tobacco, alcohol, firearms, especially if the directives were ill-defined, vague, or inconsistent. And then they also saw like inadequate systems to consistently and reasonably track and update the client's negative screens.
Thanks. Jen, what are you seeing with clients and in exams in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges that we've been working a lot with our clients around is implementing, well, number one, defining clearly what the ESG strategy is to begin with. Because I think, as everyone knows, there are a number of different ways that investment advisors can approach ESG investing. I mean, you can simply integrate it into your existing investment management process and look at it as another piece of information or data point that you'll evaluate. You can adopt sort of this inclusionary or exclusionary screen approach that Kelly was referencing. And some firms have gone even further and developed impact strategies where they're actively trying to generate, positive, measurable social and environmental impacts based upon the investments that they're making alongside financial returns. So I think it's really important for investment advisors to clearly identify and disclose what their practices are as they relate to ESG, because as Kelly mentioned, the SEC is essentially going to measure your activities against what you say you're going to do. So it's important that everyone's on the same page in terms of what the advisor is saying it's going to do. And then the other thing I think is that we've been working with a lot of advisors to think about how to integrate controls into the portfolio management processes so that we can make sure that the portfolio managers themselves are evaluating ESG factors and doing so at the appropriate points in the investment process, whether that's due diligence or when investment decisions are being made, or at other points in the process. But I think part of this is that, if you're as an advisor hold yourself out as implementing an ESG strategy, there's going to be some obligation for you to be able to prove that in fact the portfolio managers are managing that way. And Amy would tell you ideally that would be in writing, because if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So I mean, those are some of the high level concerns. I think with respect to third-party ratings, I sort of mentioned that before, but we're seeing a lot of advisors that are struggling to identify, what kind of, to understand the assumptions and the methodology that third-party rating firms are using and to ensure that they disclose any limitations appropriately. And then for firms that are trying to come up with their own approach to ESG investing that doesn't rely on third-party ratings, I think that there is a lot of concern around uneven data in different areas. So there may be a ton of data around climate-related issues, for example, but less data on, social considerations. And so firms really need to think about whether, when they talk about ESG, they mean E, S, and G, or if they're focusing on particular elements, and then what sort of data they have to rely on it to substantiate their investment decisions based on those criteria.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I know I've talked to some members that have looked at different ratings and data providers, and they've said what they have to do is not only look at what do they provide, but what do these third parties not cover and not provide. And that's been kind of a helpful exercise to figure out, all right, what are we doing versus what are we getting from third party data providers, and where are the gaps, and understanding, like you said, the limitations and the gaps that are out there. So.
And just, one thing we're seeing is that where there are gaps, a lot of the third parties will make assumptions or extrapolate results, and advisors need to be comfortable with those sorts of methodologies and understand, if there are gaps in data, whether the third party is simply not relying on that data or whether they're creating something to fill the gap.
Yeah, good points. Okay, let's move on to the next area of focus in that risk alert, which is proxy voting. Kelly, this has been proxy voting generally has definitely been an active area at the SEC. Tell us about proxy voting in the ESG area.
Sure. So exams is focused on whether proxy voting decision-making processes are consistent with the firm's ESG disclosures and marketing materials. And some of the things they observed is that proxy voting may have been inconsistent with the advisor's stated approaches. So for example, public statements that ESG related proxy proposals would be independently evaluated internally on a case-by-case basis to maximize value. But in fact, internal guidelines generally did not provide for this case-by-case approach. They also noted public claims regarding clients' ability to vote separately on ESG-related proxy proposals, but clients were never provided such opportunities and no policies concerning these practices existed.
Amy, are you seeing advisors establish separate proxy voting policies related to ESG?
Well, I think that I'm not so much seeing that. I don't know, Jen, whether you're seeing that specifically. I do think, though, and it's funny that you say, Sarah, that this has been something that proxy voting has been an issue overall. Let me just say that ESG just affords another opportunity for investment advisors to ensure that their proxy voting policies and procedures are actually being implemented as written, and that they are actually doing what they say they do, and saying that and disclosing in conformity with what their practices are, because ESG is just another place for the firms to get into trouble by not doing what they say and saying what they do. In terms of proxy voting specifically, the issue is whether it's part of their proxy voting is part of the overall ESG program and part of the process of evaluating. For example, if you have a vendor doing your proxy voting, have you considered whether the vendor has incorporated the firm's position on E, S, and G in its voting processes? And are those votes consistent? And is the decision-making process consistent with the firm's ESG disclosures and with its market?
Yeah, that's a good point. I've actually gotten questions about that point that you mentioned, using a third party. I'm going to hire a third party to assist me with proxy voting, and we're going to use that third party's ESG strategy. Is that enough? And it's like, well, okay, what have you said to clients about your proxy voting, and is everything consistent? And so it's a matter of making sure you understand, if you are going to use a separate policy, does it line up with what you have disclosed and what you've told clients about? So those are important considerations. I think here too, it gets to the point that Jen mentioned about, in addition, thinking about, are you looking at all ESG or just E? If you're looking at just sustainability issues with proxy voting, or are you looking at it across the board? And what have you said to clients? And that is a good lead into our next topic, area of focus, which is marketing and communications. And Kelly, there, the risk alert highlights the need for advisors to consider a wide range of materials.
Yes, absolutely. So exams is going to review firms' regulatory filings, websites, reports to sponsors of global ESG frameworks. And to the extent that a firm communicated to clients or potential clients a commitment to follow such frameworks, they're going to review client presentations, responses to due diligence questionnaires, RFPs, and client and investor facing documents, including marketing materials. So they're going to look at all the materials in this area. And I'll just touch on some things that they observed. There were some unsubstantiated or otherwise potentially misleading claims regarding ESG approaches. So for example, they saw marketing materials touting favorable risk, return, and correlation metrics related to ESG investing, but they didn't disclose material facts about significant expense reimbursement that they received from the fund sponsor, which inflated returns on those ESG-oriented funds. Also, advisors' unsubstantiated claims about substantial contributions to the development of specific ESG products when their roles were very limited or inconsequential. They also noted some inadequate controls to ensure that ESG-related disclosures and marketing was consistent with the firm's practices. So, for example, they noted a lack of adherence to these global ESG frameworks despite claims to the contrary. Also, unsubstantiated claims regarding investment practices. So, for example, saying you're only investing in companies with, quote, high employee satisfaction. Also, they saw a lack of documentation of ESG investing decisions and issuer engagement efforts, and then failures to update marketing materials timely, like advertising an ESG product or service that's no longer being offered.
Thanks. Jen, what are you seeing in this area?
So, I mean, we have been talking to our clients a lot about the broad scope of the SEC's review of, quote, marketing materials that relate to ESG, and the fact that it goes well beyond what they say in their Form ADV or what they say on their website that the advisor is doing with respect to ESG. It really, as Kelly said, goes to all sorts of statements, not just at the advisor level, but sometimes at the corporate level in terms of what advisors are saying about ESG. And so aspirational statements, voluntary statements, that all sound very good from sort of a marketing and communication perspective, can be very problematic if the firm doesn't have the controls in place to ensure that they're doing what those statements say they're doing. And, the third-party frameworks and voluntary organizations is a good example. Many firms have signed on to different standards, and they all have obligations associated with them. And so, if an asset manager is going to hold themselves out, for example, as being a part of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is very popular these days, then the firm also has to look at what the obligations are for signatories to those standards. And in that case, some of those go well beyond just ESG strategies and go to what the advisor is doing across all its advised accounts. And so we're trying to ensure that firms are thinking holistically about communications relating to ESG as sort of a starting point, and then that they have procedures in place to review those materials to make sure that they're internally consistent and that they're not overstating what the firm is actually doing in practice.
Yeah, when you say overstating, that leads into, we hear something in the ESG area called greenwashing. What is that and what should people look out for?
Yeah, I mean, greenwashing is an older term. It didn't just come to light with respect to ESG, but certainly there's been a lot more focus on it in the last few years as more and more assets have flowed into ESG related products. But it basically means marketing investment products or strategies as being green or environmentally friendly or whatever the claim may be, without actually making a meaningful change in your business practices to substantiate that claim. Or worse, having business practices that may be inconsistent with what the marketing claims are. And so greenwashing is a term that's applied very broadly outside of the investment management community. Across consumer products and other sorts of environmentally friendly products and services. But it goes to this whole concern that the regulators, I think, appropriately have of making sure that claims that investment advisors are making with respect to ESG related products are accurate and can be substantiated and are not being, sort of overstated or exaggerated.
Yeah. I would also add on the third-party framework point, the certain third-party frameworks may not only apply to strategies, but you also may have to look internally to the firm itself. For example, does the framework have any obligations at the firm level related to sustainability or related to hiring and diversity, equity, and inclusion issues? So it's just very, very important when you're thinking, maybe marketing comes in and says, okay, we need to sign on to these 3 things. Well, what do they involve? It's probably not a one and done thing. It's probably ongoing, ongoing compliance, and there may be ongoing reporting, periodic reporting. So those are just all good things to keep in mind and good questions to ask. What comes with this framework? What do we have to do now? What do we have to do on an ongoing basis? So.
And if I might, Sarah, and apologies for I have no idea the break in the force there. But the other thing about a variety of marketing and similar types of communications is getting to this place where a decision needs to be made of the level of materiality, because the question of whether or not something is advertising or marketing, or whether it rises to the level of being material enough to actually need to get into your disclosures, whether they're public company disclosures or your ADV, I think is actually going to be a real issue around a lot of these ESG questions. And I think it is going to be a big part of what the commission wrestles with in terms of what's required here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Okay, so let's move on. The last area of focus in the risk alert is compliance programs. And Kelly, you've talked about some of this, but there's definitely highlighted the need for controls in several different areas.
Right. So as I mentioned, exams is going to conduct a review of firms' written policies and procedures and their implementation, compliance oversight, and review of ESG investing practices and disclosures. So I'll just talk about some of the things that they observed. For the compliance programs, they saw some programs that did not adequately address these ESG issues. So some firms that were substantially engaged in ESG investing lacked policies and procedures addressing their analyses, decision-making processes, or compliance review and oversight. So for example, some compliance programs did not address this alleged adherence to global ESG frameworks. They lacked policies and procedures to ensure that firms obtained reasonable support for their ESG related marketing claims. There were inadequate policies regarding oversight of ESG focused sub-advisors. Some firms also had difficulty substantiating adherence to stated investment processes. such as supporting claims made to clients that each fund had received a high score for each separate component of ESG, like we just mentioned, the E, the S, and the G, when instead the advisor was relying on composite ESG scores that were provided by a sub-advisor. Also, exams observed that some compliance programs were less effective when compliance personnel had limited knowledge of relevant ESG investment analyses or oversight over ESG related disclosures and marketing decisions. And then finally, exams noted some weaknesses in compliance controls regarding performance metrics included in marketing materials, such as risks, returns, or correlation metrics, and a lack of compliance review of data underlying those metrics.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Amy, I would imagine that you've been working with clients on developing these programs.
Yeah, you know, compliance has to be part of the program. And this is really about communicating the strategy to compliance. And if they are at the table as the strategy is being developed, obviously they'll have a better sense of what it is from the start. Ensuring, and also they'll be better able to ensure that the policies and procedures that are developed actually reflect the actual strategy. And also it will ensure that they can develop controls and test those controls. I mean, both of those things need to happen. And as Jen pointed out earlier, all of those things need to be properly documented at some point when someone from exams comes in, demonstrating that there's a process here and what the process was and how compliance was involved in it and how the controls were developed and how they meet your strategy and how they were tested. You know, ensuring that the actual disclosures and marketing materials are being evaluated against your strategy, and also to ensure that the client ESG preferences are also being monitored and tested, and how that is, and the documents to demonstrate that. These are all the sorts of things that an examiner is going to be looking for when they come in. You know, there's not a requirement here that anyone be perfect, but the fact is the ability to demonstrate each of these steps as part of your compliance program is what the expectation is.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's striking about this risk alert is it really talks about different stages of the investment process and highlights the need for compliance to be knowledgeable in this area. I think that's, you know, both of those are interesting points here. So I would encourage everyone, if you have questions, you're welcome to submit those through the chat. I think at this point, we'll move to the next slide. And Jen, so far we've talked about actions taken or to be taken by the SEC. Let's now move to the types of issues advisors should consider in managing risks related to SEC examinations and enforcement in this area.
Sure. I mean, I think that we've talked about a number of the different areas and issues that advisors should be thinking about. What's important is to sort of pull that together in a holistic manner. I think one of the things that we get concerned about is firms may look at discrete issues related to ESG or have different work streams associated with, you know, ESG. And that's fine, but there needs to be some sort of coordination or committee at some point that is cross-fertilizing those different work streams so that, you know, the different pieces of the firm are thoughtful about how the overall picture fits together. And so we've been reinforcing the idea that, you know, firms should evaluate ESG holistically, and that evaluation should be supported by the different areas, risk control areas of the firm. So you have to start with a viable governance process that ideally covers both the corporate communications as well as the investment management communications. You have to make sure that there's agreement among the firm in terms of how the firm is going to think about ESG and how to define that terminology. You know, different portfolio management teams, for example, might have different ways of implementing ESG strategies or take different factors into consideration. But ideally, there would be some common vocabulary that the firm can use so that you don't have a situation where you know, different portfolio management teams are talking about ES or G factors in a different way. Formalizing policies and procedures around the ESG investment management process, whatever that is. The marketing and communications review, which we talked about, which again needs to be broad. And, you know, many investment advisors already have very strong controls in place to review investment advisor advertising. But the ESG considerations may go outside of just what may be defined as investment advisor advertising, and may also include corporate communications and sustainability reports, particularly if the investment advisor is a public company or a subsidiary of a public company. Then they are also dealing with the issuer level disclosures, and you want to make sure that there's consistency there. The risk management and compliance infrastructure sort of goes to what Amy was just saying in terms of making sure that risk and compliance are integrated into this process. And so they have some sort of methodology for identifying, reviewing, and testing what the firm is saying and whether or not at the end of the day, the policies and procedures are consistent with the actions that the firm is taking around their ESG strategies.
Thanks. And you put together a number of good questions for advisors to think about. Amy, we'll turn to you for those. Oh, Amy, I think you're on mute.
I think we also need to move the slides. There we go. So yeah, I mean, the hope here is that firms will be able to avoid or manage anyway the risk of an exam or potentially enforcement risk. You know, a lot of these questions are really about just good governance. It seems like the most important thing is a consistent and meaningful lexicon for ESG. That's sort of the most important building block for ensuring that everyone at your organization and your clients and everyone else understands what you're talking about and how your business utilizes these terms. You know, sadly, there isn't an ESG dictionary, but coming up with one of your own will at least be helpful to make sure that across your organization, when you're using this language, that everyone understands what you're talking about. Because that's a pretty extraordinary risk of not communicating clearly to your clients and to your colleagues. Avoiding misrepresentations through specifics and through clarity, I think is pretty straightforward. And again, just good governance. But again, I think that that's hugely important. Sort of going back to this issue of what is material enough to disclose, I think that this is, again, something that you're going to have to consider for your firm and consider what's out there. What have you put out there? What have you put out there in the way of voluntary disclosures versus what are you disclosing in your required disclosures? And evaluate whether you're doing these disclosures, these marketing efforts consistently, and how consistently throughout your investment management process, including things like proxy voting. And again, for all of these various issues, evaluating what are the policies and procedures that we have in place, what are the controls that we have in place. And something as simple, and I don't know, Jen, if we want to talk about the exam large firm client climate sweep, but you know, the issues that were addressed in that sweep were very high level and broad. You know, things like, do you have a committee to evaluate these things? I mean, pretty basic. I mean, obviously there were more granular questions, but you know, just ensuring that someone is managing these issues sort of at a high level as well as at a what policies and procedures you have level. I do think that when you're talking about an undertaking this significant for firms and clients, it really does require a multi-prong address, and you need to take it both at a macro level and a micro level. I'm not being very articulate, sadly, given where I am at the moment, but there you have it. I do think that you really need to look at it both ways, and it needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed both ways.
I like that idea of having a lexicon, because like, I think that would help if you first draft, you know, get the right people together to discuss what do we mean by our ESG strategy, and is it just E or is it E, S, and G, and putting that in writing and making sure that there's agreement inside the firm of what that means. I would think that would be helpful, so that if you're talking to third-party data providers or third-party proxy vendors, that, you know, you've got your statement and you can evaluate what you receive from third parties against that statement to see, does this agree or not? And if it doesn't, what do we do about it? And how do we explain that?
Well, it's much easier when you know what you mean to then measure it against what other people mean. And then at least you can be consistent that way. And I do think that the consistency, and again, consistency and comparability is really what we're talking about here. And you know, I agree with Chair Gensler in that regard, because I do think that that is what the expectation is of the regulators here.
Yeah. And we did get an interesting question in the chat, and it was, is it fair to say that advisors have greater compliance responsibilities, for example, around investment decision, documentation, or testing for ESG strategies than for non-ESG strategies? And is that, if yes, is that a function of the strategies currently being in high demand?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Sarah. You know, I think that's a very fair question, and one that we often get. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about controls around ESG, and one of the questions clients often ask us is, do I need a whole set of policies and procedures that just relate to ESG? And the answer is no. I mean, there is a recognition at the SEC that to some degree, ESG strategies are just another investment strategy or another product that investment advisors are offering. And so there's not a need to have a separate set of policies and procedures for every different investment strategy, right? Or every line of business that the firm has. At the same time, there is a tremendous amount of scrutiny around ESG, given the focus on retail investors and the fact that there's a tremendous amount of retail investor money, both in the taxable space and also in the plan space that's flowing into ESG investments. And so the SEC is very focused on it. And more generally, the regulatory framework globally is very focused on it, because it's a political priority for a number of world leaders, including President Biden. And so it is something that's sort of prominent right now. But investment advisors ultimately are fiduciaries. And so all of these same issues that we're talking about in terms of doing what you say and saying what you do apply more generally to the fiduciary duty.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that a lot of these firms are also making statements about themselves as firms. And I think that that is really the distinguishing factor. They don't make those kinds of statements about other kinds of investments. And so that really is what puts these types of issues into a different kind of relief for ESG issues and questions, because it adds another dimension to the analysis for regulators as well as for investors in considering a particular investment advisor or investment company when making investment decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. All right, let's move on to our next slide. And Jen, we've covered some of these, but I think these are really good questions for advisors to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of these questions are designed to be sort of like a checklist or a tool that investment advisors can use to think about and reflect on some of the themes we've talked about and how it relates to their business. So the first one really gets to, you know, what are the ESG guidelines that might apply to any particular account or set of accounts, and what controls does the advisor have in place to make sure that they're managing accounts pursuant to those guidelines. The proxy voting one, I think, is something I would encourage advisors to think about, because increasingly I'm seeing advisors that spend a lot of time thinking about how ESG fits into the portfolio management decisions, but doesn't really link that up with proxy voting. And I think you either have to ensure, as Amy said, that your proxy voting practices are consistent with what you say you're doing for ESG, or you have to clearly disclose that they're not, and that proxy voting is not part of how the firm may be implementing a sustainability strategy. And I do think that proxy voting increasingly is taking on a lot of importance even outside of ESG. And so it's just a good reminder to make sure that there's real business line accountability in terms of voting proxies. I think the integration into compliance and risk management we've covered and probably beaten a bit. And so, you know, that's just a reminder to make sure that the compliance function and risk functions are integrated into this. And then the last piece is new product development. And I think as firms increasingly push out ESG strategies and develop new products and compete in the marketplace to differentiate those products and strategies, it's important to make sure that there is a new products committee or some sort of involvement at the front end by compliance and legal and risk, so that as new products are developed, they're coming up and they're being considered in the broader framework of the firm's ESG governance.
Thank you. I did want to mention the second CLE code word. It's Tuesday. So that second word is Tuesday. So I think the bottom line here is there's just a lot for advisors to think about in this space. And Amy, I think the point you made is a very good one. I think that the distinguishing point with ESG is, you know, you may market it at the firm level as far as not only a strategy, but also what you're doing. And so there is a lot to take into account in this area. And we are drawing to the end of our hour. And so I would like to, at this point, thank Kelly and Amy and Jen for a great presentation today. and I would like to thank you all for joining us. We would ask that you complete the evaluation form that you received earlier today with a reminder for this webinar. Thank you all.